to Acknowledging Identity and Deconstructing the Hidden Curriculum, how the classroom environment influences the experience of first-generation college students. My name is Tara Molengraf. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a first-gen steering committee member and the room host for this breakout session. As a reminder, today's session will be recorded, and the materials recording will be posted in December on the First Gen Institute website following the conference. So please know that if you have any questions during today's session, you can chat me directly. And now it is my pleasure to introduce your facilitator for today's session, Dr. Rashné Jehangir.
Good morning again. This session is close to my heart and aligns really well with the comments just made in our keynote by Dr. Timak Montoya. The rationale for this session speaks to where do students find a sense of place and belonging. And historically in higher ed, these places for students who are first gen and their multiple positionalities have often existed outside of the realm of the classroom. Yet the maximum time that we spend in a given space in higher ed is often in the classroom. It's where we're required to be. It's, we need to be there. And so the fact that these issues are not often raised in classroom spaces are problematic and speak to sort of that structural change that needs to occur. So this session will be a conversation, a dialogue between a really rich group of folks with multiple perspectives on the classroom and their experience in the classroom, both as students and as instructors. Tara, if you'll go to the next slide, I want to just briefly introduce our panelists. When we thought about the role of identity and hidden curriculum in classroom spaces, we wanted to make sure that we recognize that as the keynote speakers shared, everybody teaches in different ways. And the long-term assumption has been that when we talk about teaching, we're talking about faculty or tenured faculty. Yes, we play a very important part in driving how curriculum and teaching goes, but we also have many people on our campus who teach. And so we very intentionally designed a panel that would provide you with both faculty perspectives, but also the perspectives of academic advisors who also teach in many different ways, often in first-year experience programs, often in those first introductory courses where first-gen students are orienting themselves to what does it mean to be in this space that is called the academy. And then also to graduate students who play a critical role in guiding and sometimes normalizing for students their proximity to potentially what it might be to enter the academy at another phase and scale. And so I'm really excited to have this broad range of perspective and voice here with Oscar Omar Díaz, Amir Mohamed, Xavier Ravello, and Tabitha Cruz. And I will, of course, ask each of them to introduce themselves. So there'll be an opportunity for them to say a little bit more about their perspectives and positionalities. And then we will move into the questions and dialogue, reserving time for your audience questions as well. The one other thing I want to say is that part of the reason that the term hidden curriculum is embedded in this is, again, we're very well illustrated by our keynote speaker. Hidden curriculum is all of the ways in which norms, values, expectations, and I would say written and unwritten, implicit and explicit, are practiced in the academy every day. Whether we're talking about office hours or going to see the chair, these or talking about APAS or APA, are they the same things? Are they different? They're very different. These are embedded into our policy and practice. And so how we unpack that in our classrooms from the perspective of our field, our discipline, and our institution matter. So that perspective will guide some of our conversation today. So with that, I would like to ask our panelists if you would each just talk a little bit about who you are and your positionalities, and also what is it that you teach and do at the university. So I will start with Dr. Díaz, please.
Everybody, y'all can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, cool, because it's during that time where technology fails, and I want to leave that mark. No, hi everybody. Oscar Omar Díaz. I'm an academic advisor here with the President Emergent Scholars Program, and so I I'm originally from in El Paso, so I'm a long way, right? As Dr. Montoya mentioned, like the border. So I'm here in the back, like Mohamed says, like the borderlands. I'm like, yes, like it's happening. But see, my position, not only am I new to the Twin Cities, but this is actually the closest I've ever been to the northern border. And so those of us, that are from El Paso and the Southwest, we're like, I wonder what it's like. So it's amazing time to sort of not just be up here with you all, but also with the population that I love very much, right? First gen BIPOC, first year students here. So, and that's my position, right? As a community member and as a Pascuayaki being up here as, the home and guest of the Dakotas, that I actually get a chance to sort of like build family and be with family up here with y'all. So, and those are my lenses. So, with my cheesy jokes and I talk a lot about food, it's ingrained in that curriculum. So I get to bring all those goodies with y'all. So pleasure to be here with y'all.
Thank you. Amir, Mohamed?
Yes, thank you. It's sincerely a pleasure to be with you all today. As mentioned earlier, I serve as a clinical faculty of communication studies at the University of St. Thomas's Doherty Family College. I use he, him pronouns, and on a more personal level, I'm here today as the son of working class immigrants. That experience has profoundly shaped my life. It's shaped how I see the world. And so that's one of the lenses I bring. I also come as a former first-gen student. And we talk about borderlands and liminal spaces. I come as someone who sort of lives in those liminal spaces, right? Like my mom is from El Salvador, right? And my birth father's from Yemen, and my mother remarried. And so I have Mexican influences. And so like, estoy lleno de mexicanismos, and I can go a lot of different ways, and it confuses people. They're like, wait, what is it? What? And so for me, this is a wonderful opportunity. It's near and dear to me because as a first-gen student, navigating higher ed, not understanding the hidden curriculum, it was only through the help of folks who created some spaces for me that I was able to make it through. And so in many ways, my being here today is an extension of that journey, and is a way to create pathways for other folks to have some of the opportunities that I was able to have.
Thank you so much. Dr. Xavier Ravello?
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Physiology and Center for Immunology in the medical school. I came to the US when I was 17 years old. I trained in different universities in the States and also in Canada. And I came back to the US, to Minnesota in 2018. Since then, I lead a research program studying how inflammation is a mechanism of metabolic disease. And I also teach one class in the spring. It's called Physiology of Inflammation. And as you know, some of these diseases have a strong influence and consequences to minorities. So I'm delighted to learn more about you guys today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Tabitha Cruz?
Hi, everyone. My name is Tabitha Cruz, pronouns she, her, hers. I am a research associate currently at the American Council on Education, which is an education policy organization. And I'm also a fifth-year PhD student here at the University of Minnesota, majoring in organizational leadership and policy development. I also identify as a first-generation college student myself. And some of my other, I guess, salient identities through my journey in education is that I went through the community college process. I didn't have a traditional four-year experience. And so just getting to college was challenging in and of itself, with not having, the right mentors and guides and people who just, believe in you and want to see you be successful. So I found those spaces at community college. And so I know that's sometimes that gets omitted a lot from the story about the importance of community college and their role in higher ed. So I just wanted to put that out there. In terms of some other identities, I'm Latina, identify as Puerto Rican. I have been an out-of-state student for, pretty much since the beginning. I've been a transfer student. So there's some other things that kind of impact my lens and how I view access. And so those are things that I try to put forth when I'm teaching. Part of my roles here at the University of Minnesota, I've served in multiple occasions as a graduate teaching assistant and as like sole instructor of certain first year experience classes. Especially within TRIO Student Support Services, as well as with the CLA's President's Emerging Scholars Program. So First Gen is very near and dear to my heart. It's something I'm really passionate about, so I'm excited for our conversation today.
Thank you to each of you for your rich introductions. There's going to be so much that you can draw on to share with us today. I know I had given you questions in advance. I might bump around a little bit, so just be prepared. I think you all can handle it. And we'll also try to ensure that there are opportunities at the end for the audience to share questions. And certainly the audience is welcome to put things into the chat as well. And Tara and I will try to monitor that and summarize and draw those comments out for you today. So one of the things that was raised this morning and is central to this session is this notion of humanizing the educational experience and humanizing the classroom experience and thinking about the way in which students who historically have not felt these spaces have been designed for them can come to feel like they have a voice and presence and place in our classroom spaces. And that they're co-constructed, right, with them. So I want to start with a very simple question, and that is like, how do you discuss and reflect on identities or positionalities in your classroom learning spaces? And in particular, if you could also comment on you're referencing first-gen identities as well. So we can go in order. I'm happy to have people just speak when they feel ready to do so. Amir, go ahead.
Yeah, I teach a public speaking class, and so I have some really easy opportunities to allow folks to reflect on identity. And so one of the very first assignments I assign, it's a talk, and it's called a Get to Know Me Deeper talk. And in that talk, we invite folks to share sort of what factors have shaped who they are and how they come to the table. But before they ever give that talk, I actually take time to reflect on my own journey for them and just talk about the trajectory I've been on. And I try to do that in the most sort of authentic and sincere way I know how. And I don't really hold anything back. And I think that level of transparency creates a space where they feel safe to open up and reflect on their own identities. So I was talking about some of the doubts I encountered as an undergrad leading up to undergrad. 3 months before college, I didn't even know if I was going to be in college. And so just giving voice to a simple experience like that, just saying like, I wasn't sure if I was cut out for that. And then when I got there and I walk into this big lecture hall and somebody is talking about the schools, the professor's talking about the schools they've attended and how we need to be very specific about how we refer to them. My sense of belonging was like, maybe I'm not the right person to be here. Maybe I don't belong here. And I was filled with all these doubts. And so to be able to talk about those doubts and to share those in a really honest way, I think sets the stage for folks who are doing the Get to Know Me Deeper talk to give voice to some of those same experiences and to also say, but I'm really excited to be here. And so that's just a really simple introductory way in which I allow folks to sort of reflect on identity, to talk about, hey, this is who I am, this is how I show up in this space. And then, of course, we try to build that in throughout the course. But I actually think, even though I teach a public speaking class, I actually think the Get to Know Me Deeper talk would be an easy assignment, an easy way for folks in almost any discipline to start their course off, because it builds community and it affirms that who you are and how you show up matters. So that is just one way I try to discuss and reflect identity in the classroom.
Thanks, Amir. I love how you triangulated how one assignment can do multiple things, right? It's modeling, it's building community, it's introducing, it's allowing a space for vulnerabilities. It's one assignment that can do many things. I appreciate that. I invite anybody else on our panel who'd like to comment on that question as well.
I can go
Yeah,
next.
go ahead.
And definitely sort of kind of resonating with what you said, Amir, and also as well as you, Tabitha. So I've shared this story with a couple friends and colleagues and the students, but so up here in the U, in the very same building, I found this kind of like coffee machine, and it's like these coffee vending machines, put in 45 cents and you get a little coffee. And I love that machine like very, very much. Because I started at a community college. And so the very first machine that I saw at a community college, and this is like, in El Paso, so the PCC, for life. And so I see this machine, and the first instinct for me was like, wow, so this is what college students drink. I was like, I'm in that in crowd now. I was like, cool. And, I put in my monies and stuff, and I'd get this little cup. And I think in retrospect, if you were to sort of, ask my instructors back then, it's like, hey, how was Oscar? They'd probably say the same thing. They'd probably say something like, oh, he was a great guy. Horrible student though, horrible. Because I'd show up, 30 minutes late in a 50-minute class with that little cup of coffee with my pinky up, thinking that I'm like this classiest student ever. But it's only because I thought that this is how college was meant to be. I didn't really learn what office hours were until years later. And I was the kind of student that I was taking like ceramics 1, dances from Spain. And at the same time, I'd have sort of faculty and staff be like, what are you studying again? And it's just like a little bit of everything maybe. And so, because I didn't know a lot of those guidance, so when I see this coffee machine here on campus, the reality is that sometimes that cup doesn't come out. Sometimes you put in and you invest yourself in a little coffee machine and no cup comes out. And you get to see that sort of kind of knowledge and rich goodness that is your memories and your dreams, that is coffee, slip through you. And it wasn't until like another colleague or another student of mine, at the time, it goes, it's like, yo, that's why you got to bring your own cup. And that's the part that really kind of, really gets me the most. It's like, sometimes, I was walking through a space because internally the sense of belonging is internal, right? And it's only the institution that's really there in charge to make sure that they influence that sense of inclusion. And so for me, it's like, I felt as if I never really kind of truly belonged, as if somebody opened the back door and I happened to sneak in. And here I am navigating a space that I truly never really knew. And I still have those moments, right? Like even today, I was super nervous and I was like, man, I was like, I gotta be serious. I can't tell any jokes, or it's just like, I gotta be sort of like proper and stuff. And it's like, cool. And that still kind of gets me, even though still it's like, it's hard not to shut off that academic button. At the same time, it's this sort of not just conflict as Amir mentioned, these liminal spaces, right? So those liminal kind of realities in which those border hubs in which we invest ourselves in comes out to remind us, it's like, hey, what you're representing a lot of people like from the past. And so, and that's that reality, right? So when I'm in classrooms and teaching FYE courses, I do these exercises where I'll throw a lot of kind of curveballs, and I'll say something like, I'll give a lot of writing prompts. So the last one was like, for those of you who haven't heard this one, but it's like, if y'all have y'all heard the fisherman's love story about the one that got away? And the students will be like, what are you doing, mister? And it's like, well, first he floundered, then he lobster. And they'll be like, why would you say that? It's like, because I want y'all to write, to write a moment in time where you fell in love, where you fell out of love. And of course, at the curveball at the end is be like, I didn't mention sort of with like people. I'm talking about like in general, that feels like what are the times and what that feels. And so that's a way of the sort of kind of not just bridging, right? Because I'm a firm believer that you need to see yourself in the curriculum, right? And students need to see themselves and celebrate themselves in the curriculum. And so when you scaffold vulnerability in such a way, you're not that lecture, I stand here, you listen. You open up a space with a dose of reality of like, I've been there before. That seat where you're sitting in, I love so much, but I never really had that. And so and if I did, I didn't appreciate or know how. And so that's essentially that conversation started. It's essentially like, come on in, let's talk about life and death and love. Let's talk about the next steps and let's talk about your hopes and dreams. And so it's the reason why there's always like a candle or vela at my desk, because that's sort of like, doors always open like the light. So, and that's sort of essentially how I sort of introduce that space.
Thank you, Oscar. I appreciate those comments. Xavier?
Yeah, sure. Just to share my experience as I teach and mentor students, both in the lab and in the classroom. I think it's important for us to lead by example. So what I do is I try to tell them that it is possible to have a career in science and medicine. So as you may know, there's a lack of URM students and people pursuing careers in STEM. And so what I think students need to see in us is that it is possible that someone from a different country, from first generation background, we can pursue our dreams and accomplish our goals. So that's my main philosophy when teaching and mentoring students, just leading by example and letting them know that they can pursue their dreams and they're capable to achieve great things in academia. That would be my contribution.
I want to ask a quick follow-up because I was struck by, what Amir said when he talked about being in a field like communication and teaching course on public speaking. You said, some courses offer easy opportunities, right? Because of the nature of the curriculum. And so part of what I'm hearing you talk about, Javier, is what happens when it feels like the curriculum doesn't offer the easy opportunity. How else then do you cultivate that sense of space and mentorship for students? Because the assignment may not allow for X, Y, or Z to occur beyond introduction. So I appreciate those comments. And when we speak about hidden curriculum, I may ask more on that as well. Tabitha?
Yeah, so identity is something that's really important to me. And so I try to implement that in every class discussion as best as possible. Identity as an individual, and then identities as we operate in systems, so that we can have these very real world application types of conversations in class. So I do that through a variety of ways. I think the ideas around identity is like starting on day one and myself modeling that and showing up and being very present and like, here's who I am, here's how I view the world from my perspective as first gen. Because I will tell you one thing, I think even going through being at this journey of like a PhD student, that I still struggle with things like imposter syndrome and not knowing what questions to ask, that has followed me my whole life long. And I think that's part of also being first gen is that, sometimes we have to be really resourceful about how to get the information that we need, because sometimes we just don't know what's out there. So yeah, so I introduce myself each semester at the beginning of class. I have the students do the same formally throughout assignments, as some of our colleagues have shared. Those things often come up in reflections. I do typically have those kinds of questions like very front and center as part of the assignments. And I do those things informally too. So being able to connect with students at the beginning of class asking them about, things that are going on in their day, making those small touch points. I think one of the biggest things that I've learned so far in teaching at the U is that students want to have spaces where they can bring their whole selves into the classroom. And so it's really important for us to like foster those kinds of spaces. I do that through things like think, pair, shares, or doing small group discussions, and then bringing it back to the larger group. But there's so much that students have to offer, and they don't necessarily get to do that in other classes or in like lecture courses where you have like 300 students. So in my courses, which are a little bit smaller, we do sit around in circles and we share and we learn from one another, and and just giving them space to be themselves. I want to tout myself as a scholar practitioner, so I'll bring a little bit of theory into the space, but I use a lot of Tara Yoso's community cultural wealth model as part of my understandings and how I develop class curriculum. So the community cultural wealth model does research also on students of color, students who are first gen. And so all of these things that academic research says is a deficit in a lot of these marginalized student populations are things that are actually of value. Just we don't, dominant culture doesn't ascribe it to that, but they are things of value within the community. And so how are students bringing their families, their cultures, their aspirations into the classroom, and that those things are valued and that they're validated in our spaces, and how can I continue to affirm them and empower them throughout our time together in the semester and even beyond as they move on to other coursework. Can I still be that person serving in a mentor capacity and doing simple things as like, being a first semester student is really hard because you still haven't built a whole lot of relationships on campus. And then it's time to apply for things like scholarships. And then you need to have recommendation letters. And, you don't, those things can be hard to ask for. And so I always kind of, put that up front, like, hey, I'm happy to do this for you if you ever need anything. So I think it's a combination of just always having that present and fostering a very open and transparent space for students to bring their whole selves into the classroom.
Thanks to each of you. I want to pause for a moment in case the panelists want to respond to each other's comments in any way before I move on to another question. And if you don't, that's fine too. I have plenty of questions. So one of the things that I find in doing this work is how do we make our ideological hopes and goals concrete? So how do we operationalize our vision of Yoso's work, of critical pedagogy, of mentorship and things like that, because we live in the ecology of our discipline and the space that it is. And some of that is, has been set for hundreds and hundreds of years in the academy. So I want to ask you this question really in the context of your own training and also the classes that you teach. That is, where do you see hidden curriculum, as we talked about at the beginning of the session, show up in your discipline, in your field, and also in your lived experience? Often it's easiest for us to answer the lived experience one, but from the teaching perspective, we're often looking at our syllabus, we're looking at our assignments, we're looking at our goals, and where do we begin to name and unpack that? So thank you for putting that in the chat as well. Part of it is just us unearthing what is the hidden curriculum and where are the different places it shows up. So I welcome your comments on that.
I will throw out a quick example, right? So you talked about hundreds and hundreds of years. This is certainly true in the field of communication. The rhetorical tradition dates back millennia, right? We're talking about Aristotle. And so if you look at most public speaking books today, they still reflect a sort of Aristotelian way of thinking about public speaking. And I've had the opportunity, I've taught at two private colleges now. The St. Thomas is a Catholic school. I taught at Bethel University, which is kind of has some Baptist leanings. And my joke to them in these private spaces was like, Jesus wouldn't actually pass this public speaking class because the sort of historical figure Jesus and the rhetoric of Jesus didn't present a thesis, preview their 3 points, signpost each point, and then review them at the end. Actually, that figure spoke in parable, and people were often left scratching their heads after he was done speaking. And so the point is that like this is this discipline is steeped in a particular cultural tradition. There's value in understanding and knowing that way of speaking, right? Like, and if you want to be legible, you have to understand that way of going about things. But let's not for a minute think that that is the only way to do things. So we have to problematize that and interrogate it a little bit.
You should put that on a t-shirt. All of that was just like, thank you. Really appreciate those comments on the concreteness of them. Who else would like to share? Yeah, go ahead, Oscar.
There's kind of changed behaviors in this given space, in this sort of world that we call like academia, right? There's this sort of, not just in curriculum, but the hidden behaviors, let alone gatekeeping and all the things that kind of come with it. And you have to adjust to those behaviors. That means that you have to sort of like, as we're talking about the borderlands and liminal spaces, it means you have to shift into not just from your true authentic self, but into sort of your academic self. That often means that you have to leave who you are behind so that you can fit within the scope that is, academia. And so, and that's part of the challenge really like in itself. So, just like how I'm going to share with you all, but we are capable of stopping time. And the only way we're able to really do that is if we stay in that moment. And the way that kind of happens necessarily is, when we teach a lesson, our curriculum is there. That curriculum isn't going anywhere. You can always just sort of send the PowerPoint slides afterwards. But the way you feel in that moment, the things that are coming up for you, the themes that sort of like gravitating, the aha moment that comes in that moment, got to stick with it. And, we're masters in our craft. And so, any good cook will tell you like, no, add some more spices and see what happens. And that's the part where, essentially we can kind of weave as crafters, is sticking with those moments, right? So when you kind of grade a sort of given paper, right, the hidden curriculum will tell us, nope, 12-point times, double spaced. This is what I want. I will deduct those points if they're like, well, where's that page number? All these sort of kind of strict rules that kind of come with it. But then we never really sort of tend to focus on, like we can hear, but are we listening? And that where it comes down to those sort of like those golden nuggets. So oftentimes we are capable of stopping that class and be like, you know what, you just mentioned X, Y, Z. Let's talk about a little bit more, because chances are if one student is resonating, others are as well too. And you can stop time and really stay in that moment in such a way. All the rules here are going to stay the same, right? Class starts at a certain time. You have to adjust to that behavior, right? It's really strict, right? You cannot be yourself, right? Even though we talk about it so much, there are rules in play, right? And so when it comes down to those conversations, whether they're in class, whether we're curriculum building or anything like that, it's important to really sort of like showcase as far as like, as Brian Brayboy mentioned in Travel Critical Race, our stories are our theories. And so, and that's the part where we really sort of need to gravitate is like, we all have a fund of knowledge, but really it's when we get a chance in class to really dip our cup in that foundation of knowledge and come up and be like, let's just take a sip real quick. And let's just sort of really expand on what we just learned, because we're really going back and forth, not just from the past, but to the present, on our way to really sort of, when we think about futurity, this is how we kind of become. And it really, we have to deviate from that path. So, and like I share with students, it's like, I don't care if you answer that question. I want to see how you apply yourself, because you might not ever reach that answer, but if you're applying yourself in that path, you're experiencing that growth. And when I share that with students, it's like, remember, like the hardest part is really to express yourself on that paper. You can answer that question that you know, but let's see, what else is coming up and what's emerging for you. And that's a conversation that hopefully, students will walk away from and be like, sad students, right? Years later, they'll be like, hey, I'm still thinking about what you said. I want to talk about it real quick. And it's like, all right, let's do it. Let's see what you got. And we go from there. And that's that joy that comes out of it.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question, but I want to give Javier a chance to comment on this and then try to come back to a follow-up question around this that speaks to some of the comments you made, Oscar. Thank you.
One important aspect of hidden curriculum we see in the classroom is the ability to find information and how to critically think about it and evaluate that piece of information. And so the expectation is that students know how to do this, but what we're learning is that there's so much misinformation in the internet. And so it's our job to guide students to the right sources of information. And even when they get there, I think it's important for us to instigate critical thinking for them to know what's true and what's scientifically sound, and not just an opinion that is up in the web. So I feel like in the STEM field, that's as important, and we see that a lot in the classroom.
Javier, do you feel like there's the classroom, but also in STEM, there's lab spaces that are classroom spaces that are different sorts of spaces in many ways. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the nature of those different spaces, if possible. And then I'll come back to this other question I have.
Yeah, absolutely. Night and day, completely different environments. In the classroom, as you all know, you're learning by listening to a lecture, by doing your homework assignments. In the lab is more an active type of learning where you are discovering and you're performing experiments with the idea of learning from your own work. And so that, in my opinion, has a very powerful impact on the students, and also presents challenges because the student has to be extremely motivated and persistent, because we often face negative results and complications. So I feel like the experience is completely different from that student in the classroom to the student in the laboratory, for example, getting some training to perform research as a career. But the skills that you gain in the lab are unique, and they could be translatable to other fields, in my opinion. I hope that answers your question.
I think it speaks to that notion of, if failure is inherent to the lab experience, or to some components of inquiry. You search and then you're like, oh, this is not it. I'm going to go down this path. Oh, this is not it. It can happen in lots of areas, but in the lab, there's a concreteness to it, right? You see it right away. Oh, that didn't work. With library research, it takes a little longer till you realize you're down a rabbit hole that's not going to get you where you want to go. So it makes me think about how do we talk about failure and whatever failure might look like with our students. And maybe I'll pose that as a question in a little bit. But before I do, when I asked you, each of you, questions about the hidden curriculum, there are a couple of themes that came up. One is sort of interrogating what constitutes knowledge or ways of knowing. The other is, how does belonging in some way create more intellectual risk-taking potentially, more deeper ways of knowing. Oscar was talking about this moment of feeling, a time. And then just critical thinking, how to engage in the acts of critical thinking. So I see those as thematic connections in your comments. I want to play a little bit of a devil's advocate in that In my earlier life, I designed learning communities, and first generation students were in this community, and the community was one of belonging. The thematic content was around identity and agency. So there were all these things that buttressed their sense of wanting to be part of this thing, right? And in my research, I found that for some students that was effective. It worked. It provided them with the supports and the sense of knowing self that they were able to translate outside of these so-called safe or brave spaces. But that doesn't always happen. So one of the things I grapple with when we talk about what we build in our class is then how do we prepare students for spaces that won't be like that? Because we're still in this process of decolonizing the academy, and we're not there yet. And so what happens when they've had these spaces, as many of you have described in your own classrooms, but then the next space is going to take 2 points off if it doesn't have XYZ, and is going to, you know what I mean? Those criteria will still exist. So I know that wasn't a question that I had on the list I sent you, but it feels like an important one for us to talk about. I wonder if you'd comment a little bit on that. There's a comment in the chat that sort of speaks to one of the questions I did prepare for you, which is, you know, how do we negotiate the emotional labor of doing this work, right? This was actually, Stephanie, this was my third question for the audience, so thanks for posting it already. We can certainly go there if that's someplace we're ready to go to. But I do think that, you know, we're dealing with the confines and the bounded space of our classrooms, but then there's the rest of the spaces, right, that they still have to negotiate.
That's right. That's right. I think there's, so there are a lot of layers to our work. And so I think part of the work is in the classroom, right? And creating those safe spaces. Part of the work is with colleagues. And so, but not to bleed into that next question, I think the challenge though is like, who takes up that labor, right? Because that burden, there's been a lot of literature written about the tax people, folks of color take on, right? In the academy. And so, but I do think there's there's a lot of layers to our work, right? And so I think we can be doing the work inside the classroom, but we can also be sort of active outside of the classroom and how we're shaping, attempting to shape our institutions, depending on the type of institution too. Some of them are really dependent on the students themselves, right? And so there's a lot of money pouring into these institutions from a lot of different streams. Some smaller institutions, maybe not the U, but some smaller institutions, if you have 10, 15, 20 students that, I mean, maybe this institution doesn't have a huge endowment, right? You have 10, 15, 20 students saying, hey, this is not meeting what I need for my experience. Those tuition dollars become very, very important all of a sudden. And so I think, you know, I always want to be careful about shifting the burden of that activism to students, because we don't want students walking out with a mortgage and no degree, right? But there is, in some ways, there's a lot of power there too, right? So kind of thinking about it from a multi-layer approach, I think, can be helpful. And then the other piece too, I guess the last thing I would say is, like, I have found for me and for my own mental health and my own sort of self-care is just like reminding, like, what can I control, like what's within my realm of control and what I can't control. Because early on in my undergrad and as I continued, I was like, I felt like I had to save white people from their racism, and that burnt me the heck out. And I'm like, I don't, so for me, where I'm at today, I'm like, you know what? That's important work. Maybe I'll do that work once in a while, but on the big picture, that's not work that I'm gonna take on. But what I am gonna do is when I see Jaime in class and I can pour into him and lift him up, I'm gonna be like, Jaime, I got you, bro. How you doing? Where you at? So anyway, so I think those are all pieces to that question that you're posing.
Thank you. It was a multifaceted question. So yes, multifaceted answers. And I think you talked about starting to go into that next question about what's the emotional labor of being attentive to identity and first-gen identity and hidden curriculum in your work. So I'm happy to have the other panelists comment on that question as well at this time. I'm recognizing we have about 5 minutes left, so I want to make sure we also allow our audience to throw in some questions in the chat.
I'll definitely respond to that. And then, this goes to something Tabitha mentioned as well too, is it is like emotionally like taxing, and it can. There's going to be times where there's a lot of tears like at play. Constantly worrying about my students as well too. Even if they just kind of walk in and I could just sort of like smell like the fear off of them, that's like, we need to talk real quick. But then there's this kind of part where, and I mentioned this with a course that I'm teaching, it's like, I know you're all going to be looking out there for like a job really soon. You're going to be needing like a letter of recommendation. And it's like, ask me. It's like, I am more than happy to like sing your praises in a resume, and I will draft letters and I'll put that title at the very end, because PhD, those titles like come they weigh. And I never had that. Right. And students will be like, how do I ask? Who can I ask? What if the instructor gets mad if I ask them for a letter of reference? Like, I don't even know what to do. And it's like, no, I don't play that game. You tell me what job, and I was like, I will go after them. And I was like, I will play this like, rah, because it's wonderful to have and for students to know it's like, hey, I got you. And it's like, I was like, I was in the doctoral program. I know like late nights, but imagine how it feels for me knowing that this letter is going to go out to someone who's really kind of trying to really hoping for it, right? And next thing you know, I'll stay up late. It's taxing, it is. But I think if you're a person, if you're passionate, because I love what I do, and my tenacity to just sort of be at the front lines and not just that, but really sort of uphold, my students, it's like, I'm never going to run out of gas. I have my moments, no doubt, but a little bit of caffeine helps like a really long way. So it's an important kind of place to really sort of be right in that liminal existence of, this is academia and this is you, and being able to support your students in such a way. It's going to be heavy. Yeah, there's going to be some really long nights, but see, that's what it looks like for us. And I cannot imagine what it's like for students who don't have anybody to reach to because it's past office hours, right? It's past working at 5 p.m. and they're like, who am I going to reach to? And it's like, you better believe I send emails out 2, 3 in the morning, because I can't imagine like the fear that students will go through feeling all alone and they can't reach out to nobody. And next thing you know, they sign up, just like you mentioned, Amir, sign up for that mortgage, and they're like, what next? And then we lose them, right? And they'll never return like to academia. And so those fears are real.
Yeah.
So,
Oscar, I'm going to interrupt you for a second.
No
because
worries.
we're close to 2 minutes before, and I want to make sure that the audience can ask questions that even if we can't answer this time, we can employ in the next session that starts up at 11:25. So I do thank the panelists for their openness and vulnerability in sharing so much here. And I'm also going to try and see if there's some questions here that we can quickly speak to or address. Yeah, I think the question that Claire raises is one that, as the First Gen Institute, we have talked a lot about creating communities of practice where we have an opportunity to unpack this at a regular basis, as opposed to carrying it for a long time and then feeling the weight of it, which we often do. So I think that's a real gap and an ongoing need. Other questions or comments that you may want to share with the speakers as we close out here? Going through the comments here. Anita mentioned this idea of it feels like we need two tracks, the dominant way of knowing to reveal it, unpack the hidden curriculum, and then offer a side-by-side interrogation of that at the same time. Makes for complicated teaching, but really a way that seems to be critical to breaking down how we move forward with this work. Well, it is 11:15, so I know that we have about 10 minutes before we transfer to other sessions. I thank you all for being here and also for our participants, and we'll be back again at 11:25 for those of you who are on the panel. Thank you.